Because Kevin Warsh is being nominated by Trump and is going through his hearings, I think he passed one of his votes, but he's still waiting on other votes. I'm not sure exactly. I apologize for my angle, but my second screen is easier to view, is larger, so the ratio between the slide being shown and the ribbon is better. So first, I'm gonna put chapters on the video. On the video, you can skip to the end of the intro. First, going to explain what the Fed is, how it works, why it was built, and so on. And then we're gonna get into the current status and what's wrong and what I would do. And also, very importantly, I think it's important to show the commonly known talking heads and the political figureheads giving remarks of what the Fed should do, shouldn't do. They're usually pretty vague and obfuscatory. Um, and I sort of try to pick them apart, see who holds what, and some of them are actually less conservative than you would think. So let's start with what is the Fed? They have a mandate from Congress in the Federal Reserve Act. I'm actually going to sort of skip to slide two here, because I'm not really going to get into this so much about like the structure, like there's different branches of the Fed and what do they do versus what does the Fed in DC do, and then like the origin and the gold standard and different things. I'm just going to reference it here so you could see it. I'm not an expert on this thing. I just know these are sort of turning points or just notable points in history of the Fed. So I'm going to focus on the on 2008. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the gold, but I wanted to be clear that like it's not just the Fed in DC. There's Fed branches in Cleveland, in San Francisco, Chicago. So the Fed that we know, there's the chairman, who is the chairman of the board of governors. There's the branch of presidents. The branch presidents is a bunch of presidents. And together they form the Federal Open Market Committee. So let's go back to here. So the Fed is created to do two things, which was stupid. The Fed was created primarily for monetary stability, so to control inflation, deflation. Um, and I'm pretty sure, I don't know, I don't think it's in the legislative words, but it's understanding that monetary stability means err on the side of low inflation. We don't want hyperinflation or higher inflation. We don't want deflation because we have we have severe trauma from the Great Depression, which was the price collapse, deflation. And the second mandate of dual mandate is job, not job creation, but maximum employment or minimum unemployment. That theoretically, the more loose money is, the easier it is for hiring. Now, they don't really work. They're not necessarily opposite sides. It's not like if there's more inflation, there's more jobs, or vice versa. They are sort of correlated. It's not exactly depending on other external factors. All else equal is they are generally opposed. Then you have the mission creep, the third mandate, the so-called third mandate, which is from either political pressure, or if the bankers at the Fed believe in a different theory of money, or the banks are putting pressure on Congress or directly on the Fed. There's such a thing because a lot of the bankers in the Fed are former actual bankers. The Federal Reserve branches, I don't believe, are made up of like a group of big banks like Citi, Bank of America, Chase. I believe the private banks are private. I mean, even publicly traded, they're still in the private sector, not public sector. Um, and then the Federal Reserve branches are just nowadays you don't really need to have actual branches. I don't believe you need to have branches in specific economic centers like Chicago, or LA or New York. So yeah, I think there's a New York branch. I don't know. I think there's five branches. I don't know sure exactly where they are. There's New York, Chicago, Cleveland, San Francisco, maybe Seattle, or something like that. Um, right. So the mission creep, the third thing, which I mentioned the causes, is keeping long-term interest rates moderate. Like basically, the government borrows money on bonds, bills, and notes. The bonds are longest term, and the Fed wants to subsidize or enable the government to borrow at cheaper rates. The sort of it's a informal conspiracy. Conspiracy meaning that they are actually teaming together to say, well, we're going to buy your debt so that you don't have to spend so much of your budget on the interest. It's more of an informal where they all believe in the same thing and they're doing it anyways. Um, so what this thing of how do they get the rates lower, or how do they buy things? We're gonna get to that soon. So so we covered what they were supposed to do since creation was to control the money supply. What they have become, they do control the money supply. They do that very effectively. What but the results are the results are sort of or foreseen and intended not to screw the to screw the poor guy and to inflate the currency wasn't the intention. I mean, you could have left everyone on a ledge. It was a conspiracy by the bankers to create the Fed to help the bankers. Whether they actually thought of the whole long game and what it would do to the economy, and I think they were more like we need to prop up the banks. If the small guy loses, too bad on him, but we're gonna, and also it would smooth out the economy. That was a talking point at least. We're gonna see that since then with the FDIC and different things, that the Fed doing what it does now is not, you don't need the Fed to do that in order to to help the economy. So it's not like you can't prove that it was. I mean, there's different books on that it was a conspiracy at Jekyll Island with the senator Archer. I forget what his name was, with JP Morgan and the other guys. It was a group of guys meeting in secret, but they weren't conspiring against the people. They were what their ends were not in the better interest of the people, but they weren't trying to screw everybody else necessarily. I don't know why I'm defending them, but my point is the Fed isn't inherently evil. The Fed is a very dangerous tool, and it can be very useful to do what the Fed was designed to do by Congress. But it's been used for the wrong reasons, or it's been whatever. So let's get to how they actually do what they do. So what power does the Fed have? People think that the Fed prints money. Fed doesn't have a printer. You know, the name of the Fed of Jerome Powell is just cranking the printer. That's not how it works. Only the Treasury has the constitutional right power to mint and coin currency of paper and metal or any type. The Fed was given the power to stabilize the currency. To do that, they have to have some power over the currency. Um, Now, you could argue theoretically that the Federal Reserve Act was unconstitutional because in order to have control over the currency, you must have power over minting. When the Fed was created, there wasn't there wasn't electronic. It wasn't computers. In 1913, there were no computers. It was by telegram. So, and there was paper ledgers, or they probably did ship. I don't know if they shipped cartloads and trainloads of cash across the country. It was telegraph, and they would send telegrams, and they would mark a digit on the ledgers in the banks. But which is basically the same thing what they do nowadays. Nowadays, it's just digital on a computer where um, the power is that they can create money. They don't create money in a vault in the Fed. How they create money is have the tools, right? So before 2008, the tool was that there's a discount window, which no one actually used, but the Fed essentially, when somebody wants to borrow money from the Fed, the Fed types a number or adds a deposit, a digital deposit into the bank, and records an asset in the Fed that the bank owes the Fed. We're gonna get to the balance sheet soon. Um, but that's essentially what the Fed does. They record that in the in the bank's account, they record a deposit, and in the Fed, they record that there's an asset that the bank owes the Fed money. So they created money out of nowhere, right? Now, the even before 2008, the Fed was able to either lend money to banks or buy assets from the banks. Same way they either lend money, like I said, or they would buy things which buying instead of creating an asset of a debt owed to the Fed, they would buy a security, usually a treasury, a treasury bond, and they would hold the bond and earn the money on the bond, and the Fed would make money off the interest of the bond, and the bank would have the money that the Fed created to buy the treasury. And if the Fed wants to sell it back to the market, the Fed both are willing participants. The bank isn't forced to deal with the Fed. The Fed isn't forced to deal with the bank. The bank can ask for a loan, and the Fed can say yes, we'll give you a loan, or the Fed says I want to buy Treasury. They go to the banks and they find a willing participant, and they make that exchange. It's not an in real exchange because the money is created, and when it's sold back, the money is deleted. That's how the Fed works. The discount window is when the Fed lends. And when the Fed lends, basically no one charges higher. If the Fed will lend you at 5%, nobody can charge higher because why would I pay anyone higher if if I can go to the Fed and get it for cheaper? That's the ceiling. Lending is the ceiling, and the borrowing when the when the Fed borrows or the banks deposit money at the Fed, which happened after 2008. I think before 2008, the banks had to have reserves or fractional reserves. That's for another video, but the banks had to have reserves either at the bank or at the Fed. I'm not sure which one. But before 2008, the Fed wasn't paying them interest on that money. After 2008, the Fed had to, not legally, but in order to keep inflation, basically, if you're going to say that the banks have to hold more reserves, the banks now have more reserves to lend out to anybody else. To make sure the banks don't lend out all those new reserves, the Fed has to bribe them, not bribe them, but they have to pay them interest so that for anyone else to get the same loan from that bank, they would have to pay a higher interest to the bank. So essentially, the IORB, the interest on reserve balances, is a floor of interest rates for the overnight rate. Okay, I'm going to explain soon. These two, this lending here and this borrowing here, or from the point of view of banks, this borrowing here and this lending here are not long-term borrowing and lending. These are the overnight rates, which is only applicable for banks inside the Fed, or banks only for banks really, because banks have to have a certain amount of money overnight, every single night. It's basically a ratio. It's the fractional reserve ratio. It's how much money they have to cover obligations. So the banks have to have a certain amount of money at the Fed or at the bank, and the Fed once they since 2008, when the reserve requirement went sky high, now the banks have tons of cash and don't know what to do with it. So the Fed pays a rate to the banks to keep that cash at the Fed instead of someone else getting that cash for less, paying a lesser, instead of someone else borrowing it from that bank and paying the bank a lower interest. Why would the bank lend the money to someone else for less than what the Federal Reserve is going to pay the bank? That's the floor. So those are the two things, borrowing and lending. The FOMC, again, the FOMC is the Federal Open Market Committee, which is a fancy way of saying the Fed is a market participant, can buy and sell securities on the market. Market meaning on the stock market, They can go to over the counter, they can buy things, they can sell things. So the Fed buys assets, again, treasuries, anything that can make money is an asset. So mortgage-backed securities. If the bank lends a mortgage, the Fed can buy the mortgage from the bank and make the interest and payments instead of the bank. Um, so the asset purchases or forces more reserves. By buying things from the banks, you're substituting that what was a treasury, a bond at the bank is now cash. So you're inflating the reserves, giving more reserves. When you have more reserves, you're lowering interest rates. Unless you have if you have an IORB, or if you have a rate that the Fed pays them to have the reserves at the Fed, then fine. But the neutral, the natural rate, the more reserves you have, the lower the rate is because the bank has more money than they know what to do with. So they're willing to lend it out for pennies. So let's first we're going to explain more how the balance sheet works. Because on in regular accounting for any business, there's assets on one side and there's liabilities and owner's equity on the other side. The Fed doesn't own anything. The Fed doesn't own value. It's just a government entity. It's not exactly governmental. There's just the people that are private. It's weird. It's complicated. It's a quasi-governmental agency. Um, so there's no actual liabilities. There's no actual owner's equity. There's no owners. So what does it mean, a balance sheet? It means that when the Fed creates money, like I said, the Fed creates money in the bank's account. Now, it could be the bank's account at the Fed, or it could be the bank's account at the bank. I don't think it makes a difference. It's probably at the Fed. This brown area here in the liability section, in the negative area, is the bank's reserves. The blue is United States Treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, and other odds and ends. There was currency before the 2008 crisis, before the reserves, because the reserves are because of a new rule since the crisis. Um, they expanded how much they grossly expanded how much the banks had to hold. So it's not like it's not a liability that the Fed owes money. It's a liability to sort of the economy. The Fed does own these things because they bought it from the market, but because they have to show an opposite side of the balance sheet, it's not owner's equity, it's liability. They owe it back to the economy, and when they sell it back, when the Fed sells back the assets to the market, or they mature and expire, like debt, when it matures, you have to pay back the loan. The loan's gone. Now the reserves and the currency will be deleted from the Fed. The same way they were created, they will be deleted. That's how the balance sheet works. It's weird to call it balance sheet, and it's very confusing for people because there's no money owed. There's no money owned either. So the Fed owns it in that it bought it and that it will sell it or that it can mature. But there's nobody that owns it. Any money that the Fed makes on interest, any net income the Fed makes goes to the Treasury. The Treasury doesn't pay the Fed. If the Fed loses money, they have to make it up later. They'll just hold it forever. They'll just hold the loss until they make it back. Um, Now let's go explain the effect of the overnight rates. Because we said there's the overnight rate, there's whatever the banks can charge for different loans, shorter or longer term, and then there's the government has bonds, bills, and notes. So let's look at a flow chart the overnight of the overnight rate to the long rate. So banks are required to hold reserves, right? The banks lend to each other at the FFR. Like I said before, the banks before 2008 even are required to hold a certain percentage of their holdings in actual cash. They can lend out, they can do business, but they have to have a certain amount of money every night in the bank or at the Fed. And so in order to keep that, for each bank to have that amount of money, sometimes they have to borrow overnight, give the money overnight, and then send it back to where they got it from. Bank A has extra, Bank B doesn't have enough, so Bank B borrows from Bank A overnight and gives it back the next morning. So the overnight rate is also called the federal funds rate. After 2008, it wasn't just a rate that the banks paid each other or charge each other. Now, after 2008, there's an interest on reserve balances that the Fed will pay the banks to keep the money at the Fed instead of loaning it out to other banks. Why did the Fed do that? Because after 2008, they raised the requirement of how much money they have to hold in reserves, and now if they didn't charge the bank, if they didn't pay the banks interest, the banks would lend it out to other banks at a much lower interest rate. Now the Fed pays those banks a rate. So no, and for anyone else to get those same reserves, the recipient banks would have to pay the banks the even higher rate. That's the essential flora, like I explained earlier. What if the Fed lowers the IORB? What if the floor goes down? Or if there is no IORB and there's still a lot of reserves in the system? Lower rate, easier credit, and it will be inflationary. It's non-Keynesian because Keynes believes that more money will just stimulate the economy further, and the economy will make more products. Fine. Then higher inflation expectations from easier credit will drive up the interest on long-term debt. Why? Long-term debt, the cost of debt or the interest is based on as a bunch of different contributions or things that comprise the cost. There's there's inflation. My money is going to be the one is going to be worth less later. I want to be paid something to offset that. Then there's growth of the economy. If the economy is growing, I should get some of that. I should get a piece of that pie. And I'm pretty sure there's a third thing, time value of money, but which basically means essentially the same as growth of the economy. Pretty sure that there's three official things, but there's sort of semantic, I guess. It's kind of splitting hairs. Okay. When there's a higher demanded return, the Treasury, when they want to sell more debt, has to raise the interest that they're willing to pay the banks to buy the debt. Then you have a higher interest rate on the treasuries. When there's a higher interest rate on the treasuries, the Fed, there's two things that happen. First of all, now there's a higher floor for mortgages and corporate credit. When treasury rates are higher, mortgages and corporate credit also go higher. Why? What does it mean a floor again? Floor is because the treasuries are risk-free or the government won't default, right? So if the treasuries are offering 4%, mortgages have to offer the mortgage rate must be at least 4%. Because why would I lend out a mortgage at 3% if the treasury is offering 4% for risk-free? Um, Corporate credit and more is a little bit more complex because there's risk. Maybe there's more risk in corporate. I don't know. Base, pri private debt versus treasury debt is different in that the market sort of because the Fed has been known to buy up treasuries when there's risk in the market, there's sort of an opposite relationship where risk pushes up rates of private debt, whereas treasuries risk lowers the rates because the market sometimes anticipates the Fed bailing out the government debt. Uh, and then the second effect of higher rates on long-term treasuries is that the Fed now has pressure to buy up those long-term treasuries to lower the rate. If you have more people who are interested in buying the same amount of debt, then the interest rate drops. Or if the debt was if a 10% treasury was already sold then and there's more people willing to buy it, then it's worth less because I'm willing to accept a lower rate because I want to buy it. It's easier. I'm not going to try to explain why higher demand for the debt lowers the interest rate, or vice versa. It makes sense on that level, but if you think about it on an individual coupon that's already bought, then why is it lower? It's a little bit it's a little bit more abstract. Um, so that explains the flow of inflation and pressures. Uh, Now let's go to, so I believe I covered essentially the difference between pre-2008 and post-2008. Pre-2008, it was nobody was using the discount window. People were just it was being had a certain required reserves, and they were lending for the overnight rate, and based off how the economy was doing, fine. And the Fed would buy or sell treasuries in order to on the open market operations, the OMO. Um, I think the FOMC would do the OMOs for all the alphabet soup, right? And that's how they would sort of control inflation. Once 2008 happened, and it was a massive crisis, and would have spiked inflation, would spike the interest rates, not inflation, spiked interest rates, and nobody wanted to use the discount window because the discount window meant you were in serious crisis. Even though if you use the discount window, then you would have enough money, and everything would be solved much easier and more stable. But nobody wanted to use a discount window, so they were scared of bank runs. Some banks did actually collapse, and some banks it was big fish eat small fish, but they changed the rules after that. And now, instead of having just the discount window ceiling, they made the IORB floor, but they didn't make the floor because they wanted to raise rates. They needed to make a floor because they had to bail out the banks, they had to inject tons of cash. They had to buy up all this bad debt, so the balance sheet expanded because they bought up all these treasuries. The banks had more reserves because all of that money to buy the treasuries went to the banks. Now the banks had so much cash, they didn't know what to do with it. If they had so much cash, the interest rates go low because they're willing to throw this cash around for very low interest rates. So the Fed had to do the IORB, so a floor for the interest rates. Okay. Now let's go to what are our options now. Now that we have a Fed post 2008, we have a massive balance sheet, we have a tons of government debt, we have inflation that's brought down since COVID, but it's still 2.5%, and this is ridiculous. So Trump has a nominee called Kevin Warsh. What's his plan? If you just sell treasuries as is, period, then you're gonna have a higher cost of interest on the treasuries on the long term, and then you're gonna have a problem that the reserves are gonna be too low. So Warsh's plan is lower the rates, lower the IORB. According to Gemini, he actually wants to go back to the corridor where there's no IORB, there's just a ceiling, and the market has to decide where it wants to go. Selling treasuries, selling off the balance sheet will put pressure on the rates to go up because there's going to be less reserves. First of all, there's less reserves for the overnight rate, and long-term rates will also go up because those treasuries are long-term and they go back on the market. So more supply of debt, and nobody wants less. Same amount of people want to buy it. So fine. So so first of all, he wants to tell the Treasury, hey, we're selling out for long-term debt. You better convert your long-term debt, start issuing more short-term debt. If there are less long-term treasuries on the market, not because the old ones are disappearing. Yes, the old treasuries are maturing and disappearing, And if the government is not issuing new long-term debt, but bonds, only issuing bills instead of 30 and 10 years, they're issuing only 5 year or 2 month. But I don't know exact ranges of dates. But either way, if less long-term treasuries on the market, so then the floor is weaker. Let me explain. Usually, again, the treasuries are the floor. The mortgages and corporate debt have to offer corporate debt and mortgage rates have to be at least as high as the treasuries because treasuries are risk-free and those are riskier assets. If there are less treasuries available for lenders on the market to buy or lend, then basically there's a dog pile where the the lenders are going to try to buy up the treasuries and therefore lowers the rate on the treasuries, so the floor is lower. Also, that once there's no more treasuries to buy, the mortgage rates can go lower than the floor because there's still more demand for debt and there's supply of debt. So even though they're riskier, if there are no treasuries left to buy, the floor is quote unquote leaky. What does AI have to do with anything? Well, if you're inflating the currency by lowering the IORB, um, then you need a deflationary miracle. Yes, you're selling long-term treasuries, so you're the so that's deflationary. But if you're lowering the IRB, then if you're trying to keep that balance, if you're relying on AI to be deflationary, you're misguided. Now, I don't know if he's, I don't know why Kevin Warsh is mentioning the AI hype. Maybe it's because it's in vogue. He wants to seem like he's not. He wants to give. If he goes too much in the weeds about why about how his planet works without AI, it's too complicated. So maybe that's why he's bringing up AI, but it doesn't really make a difference. So what might Warsh be doing that he's not saying that he wants to do, which is my proposal. So the LCR is what's basically the liquidity requirement. So either allow, it's go clear over here, either allow the discount window to capacity of banks to borrow. They haven't borrowed yet. Either allow the capacity to count towards the reserve ratio, therefore you can drain the reserves without having a problem, or you you force banks, you teach the banks to use the discount window without triggering a crisis to show them that, hey, just use it. Fine, done. Once you do that, you can drain away the reserves. The Fed can shrink the balance sheet, drain off the reserves, put the treasuries back on the market. Oh, and now the government has a problem because all those treasuries are now on the market. Who wants them? Well, the banks have to buy them. No, not have to, but in order for the Fed to offload them, someone's got to buy them because you can't force anyone to buy them, but someone's going to buy them. If banks have access to the discount window and they use it and they don't have to keep reserves, then basically interest rate on the overnight interest rate is gonna be a natural rate. The banks don't have tons of reserves that they don't know what to do with, so it's gonna run in between the discount window and zero. It's not gonna be zero because there's scarce money. It's not gonna go above discount because that's the ceiling. And if banks want to buy the treasuries by borrowing from the discount window to finance that, if it makes sense for them to do that and paying the discount window rate, then they can. Otherwise, the government has to find someone else to buy it for. So the Fed is a lender of last resort of the discount window, and if the Fed decides that that they want to widen the window, they want to let the interest rates run higher before they give help, they can either have a tiered per bank tiered penalty, like they can, depending on how much the bank is using it, they can charge more for higher volume to flag it or something. Um, I think that's basically all of this of the proposal. There's and if inflation is if the natural market if there's a mania of the market is going is really high and there's loose money and banks are just lending for every single stupid thing with the banks are being stupid, the Fed can say, "Hey, wake up," and they can reinstitute the IRB at whatever rate they think is necessary, and the banks say, "Oh, you can't, you have to pay up an interest rate over here if you want to borrow from us, because otherwise we're going to give it to the Fed." So that would be the idea. There's a summary here which you can use to take a screenshot of. Um, Basically what I said. But before I go, I want to show you the current sort of talking heads, the figureheads of the Republican Party, and see how they're not all saying the same thing. So this is Kevin Warsh is closest to what I want to do. This is actually a more simplified version. These are my ideas. Narrow mandate is just to codify this in legislation, but these three are what I want to do. I want to shrink the balance sheet. I want to force the discount window usage so that they don't freak out whenever they have to use it before a crisis. Um, and I want to go back to pre-2008 where there's no IRB. What we're not the Fed isn't deciding how much to charge, how much we need to have interest rates in order to not have inflation or to have a certain amount of inflation. Let the market decide how much it wants to charge. If there's a mania, there's different metrics. So if you go back here, we can see that there's different rules, there's different math you can use to to trigger different actions. I'm not a mathematician. I just have a basic idea, the principles of how it's supposed to work. So I don't know the Taylor rule is exactly. These are screenshots from Gemini, giving a summary. Um, this is a kind of interesting idea. That shadow chair is where before Powell resigned or was supposed to give up his chair, they appointed Moran and they appointed Warsh as signaling to the market what they plan to do, what's going to happen at the Fed. C4 was all about the gold. Larry Kudlow would like not just Larry Kudlow wants the Fed to do whatever Trump wants to do, as well as Kevin Hassett wants some lower rates. They have different ideas. Some of them have more merit than others. I'm not pro the gold standard because the gold standard doesn't allow for absorption of crisis. Once you have a crisis, gold is brutal. There's no elasticity. Um, let's go here. The last slide here, because gold and other commodity based currencies have to do with this thing that in the 1930s there was a deflation, basically the Great Depression. And what happened? It wasn't because there was innovation. It wasn't because we farmed too much and had a glut. That wasn't what happened. What happened was there was a string of defaults and bank runs. And when bank runs happen, it's deflationary because debt expires. When you default on debt, the money that the bank thought they were going to get disappears. They're not going to get it anymore. That's deflationary. There's less money around. When there's less money around, prices go down because the money that there is, it's the money to price to goods and services, the ratio goes like this. And now this amount of money can buy this amount of goods. So the money is worth more. Money is worth more, but the prices are lower. So the people who are selling things want the old money back. They don't want the new money back. And the people who the debtors have the new money is worth more, but they have to pay back the amount of 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 money from according to the old money. Meaning, if I borrowed $100, now $100 is worth more, but because $100 is worth more, I can only make $80 now. $80 is worth $100, but I still have to pay back $100. So for the same amount of economic output, I can only earn $80 and I still have to pay back 100. That's why deflation is bad for debtors. Everyone basically knows the opposite, why inflation is good for debtors. Because I make 120, I make $120 now. It's worth the same, it's worth 100, but I only have to pay back 100. So when there's a debt deflation spiral where people don't have enough money to pay back debts, then more debts crash in on each other, and the price and the dollars were attached to gold, and gold doesn't move, so they would have to print money. They couldn't print money because they weren't allowed to. Um, so that's what happened. I believe this pretty much does it. This is the end of the day. I'm with Warsh on these. Um, I don't think Warsh argues with Besant here on this issue, but I think Warsh is more of a fundamentalist and that he doesn't want to subsidize smoothing out crises, whereas Besant is more strategic in that, or enforcing the banks on getting the banks using the discount window. And then finally, the narrow mandate. Both Warsh and Besant don't really talk about the mandate. Warsh wants to redo a Fed accord with the Treasury, but only really Forbes has mentioned just stripping out the maximum employment out of the legislation completely. So they all have what to say, but some of these guys who are mentioned, like Hassett and Kudlow, are really not. They're almost Keynesian. They're not. They're just whatever Trump wants to do is great. More money in the system, more growth, but they're not thinking about inflation so much. So I wanted to point that out. All right, hopefully this wasn't way too long. I'm not sure how long this was, so yeah.